Thank you, my. Thank you, Mandy. Beautiful, beautiful. He is the God of the hills and valleys, is he not? Amen, amen. Today is a different type of message. I hope you'll take it as that. It's one that I've prepared partially on my own experiences, as I do sometimes, as pastors do sometimes. It's an interesting subject. What does the Bible say about the Kurds? The Kurds. We've heard a lot about the Kurds lately, and you might be saying to yourself, what do I know about the Kurds, as I used to say when I was back when. We've heard a lot about them because we've been very involved with them in recent times in fighting the ISIS, radical Muslim individuals who are trying to kill a lot of people all around the world, and especially us. And we were involved with them in Syria and other places over in Iraq and in that region. And recently, for different reasons that we don't understand, perhaps the president said we're going to withdraw from Syria and we're going to move away from the Kurds. So immediately the Kurds became front and center in the headlines. I'm not going to get into any of that. This is not political in any way. It's simply dealing with what is the biblical significance of these people called the Kurds, because they are biblically significant. You'll see that as we go through here. And that's the only reason that I want to talk about this today. To give you a little of my personal background, just to set the stage for this, when I was in my mid-20s or so, I was very fortunate. I was in the Air Force. I was stationed in Europe, and many times I would travel to Turkey. And there was one place in particular that I would go there. It was one of our bases in Turkey called Incirlik, Turkey. And, you know, that was what, mid-20s, probably 20 years ago, maybe, you know, something like that I was there. Well, maybe a little bit longer, but anyway, something on that order. I'm not good with math, you know. Anyway, I would go to Incirlik, Turkey, and one time when I was there, I, of course, worked with some individuals there at the base. One time when I was there, I had a good friend who was a Christian, a fellow Christian, and I said to him, you know, why don't we go down to a place called Tarsus? Now, you know from the Bible, Tarsus is a very important place because that's the hometown of Paul. That's where Paul grew up, was raised, and so forth. And I had just this wonderful feeling about Tarsus because I knew it was very historic. The Romans had been through there, the Roman ruins and all kinds of things. I said, let's go to Tarsus and see what's there. He said, fine, we'll do that. So we had planned to go on a given Saturday when I was there, and long story short, that morning when we got up, he said to me, he said, I'm sorry, he says, I don't think we can go today because they're having a demonstration down there. He says, you know, there's a lot of unrest in this country, in Turkey. And he says, there's some demonstrators and it's not a good idea. So I said, well, what about this? What about as an alternative, why don't we go to Mount Ararat? You see, Mount Ararat is also in Turkey. We know that's where the ark landed. And I said, why don't we go there and see that? He says, oh, that's not a good idea either. He said, that's where the Kurds are. That's where the Kurds are. And I said, well, what's wrong with that? And he said, well, the Kurds are not necessarily friendly towards any outsiders. He said, they have a lot of conflict with the Turks, which they do. And they have that to this day, and you've read about that or heard about that perhaps on the news. So immediately my interest was piqued. I said, well, I need to learn more about these people called the Kurds. And I researched in the Bible, and I found that the Kurds are very significant all throughout the Bible, or at least primarily in the Old Testament. And I'm going to share that with you today. That's the intent of my message today. Who are the Kurds? The Kurds are, like I say, biblically significant. They played a role in so many of the stories of the Bible. but we know them in the Bible as the Medes, M-E-D-E-S, the Medes. You never see the word Kurd, you'll see the word Medes, all in various places in the Bible. And this is the way they came about. This is their origin. We all know that Noah, of course, was in the ark, and he and his family were saved, a total of 8 people. We know that when they landed, he had his family, which consisted of 3 sons, okay? 3 sons, and they were Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Now, we don't care too much about that in relation to today's story, except for this reason. Japheth had a number of sons, and one of those sons was named Madai, M-A-D-A-I. Madai was a grandson of Noah. And Madai is the person, the individual, who began the line, the lineage of the Medes, the M-E-D-E-S, the Medes, the people we're talking about today, the Kurds. That's the significance of that. The Medes settled in a place called Amida, A-M-I-D-A. That's in southeastern Turkey. And the reason they settled there was, well, a number of reasons. They found it very hospitable. They found it to their liking, but primarily because it was very rich in copper, which is, of course, a very remarkable commodity, very expensive commodity in today's market. It was rich in basalt. They had huge walls that they built around their cities of basalt, beautiful black basalt, sort of like granite. And so they prospered. They were an industrial people. The Medes are not Arabs. I want to be very clear about that. They're not Arabs. They're people like we are, non-Arab in other words. Amida, this city called Amida where they lived, was renamed in the 7th century, and it was renamed and called Diyarbakir. Diyarbakir, don't worry about the spelling, it's too long. But Diyarbakir is also a very important city. Diyarbakir is the 3rd largest city in Turkey. There's also a military installation in Diyarbakir. We used to have an intercept site there that would listen to the Russians and that would intercept their signals, their communications, their telemetry, a lot of things like that. Diyarbakir is very significant in a number of ways. But here's what's really significant about all of this. The Medes are a large group of people. The Kurds today are a large group of people. They're somewhere between 35 to 45 million Kurds on the face of the earth. And yet they don't have their own country. I'll get into that later, but I want to start off with that. They don't have their own country. These highly intelligent, industrial-based people do not have a country of their own. They live in Turkey, they live in northern Syria, over in part of Iraq, and in the northern part of Iran. So those 4 countries, parts of those 4 countries, are where these Kurds, these Medes, lived and live today. Okay? That today is called Kurdistan. You've heard the word Kurdistan. That's where the word Kurdistan is important because it means the Kurds live there. Very simple, okay? But Kurdistan is not a country, again. It's a region. It's an area that encompasses those 4 countries: Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Okay, stick with me. This is a little bit complicated. I know. I'm sorry if it is. Anyway, these Medes later would fall under Arab domination, but they were not Arab, as I say. They would later be subjected to the Muslim religion, and some of them accepted it, some of them did not. Now, they're known as a stateless nation. What do I mean by that? That means they don't have a nation of their own. They have this region that I talked about, Kurdistan, but they don't have their own nation like we do or like any other country in the world, France, Britain, those kind of countries. A stateless nation is where you have a lot of people, which they are, somewhere around 45 million, a lot of people who do not belong well, they belong to whatever country they're in. They can be a citizen of that country if that country will accept them. Not all countries will accept these stateless nations, as they're called. We have stateless nations right here in the U.S. Does that ever occur to you? You may have heard of them. They are called the Sioux, the Arapaho, the Navajo, the Iroquois. Those are stateless nations. They are bands of tribes, as you know, who are culturally, ethnic, and native to the U.S. But they have to be a U.S. citizen. They can't be identified, they can on their own as a Sioux Nation or the Iroquois Nation, but they can't have any standing if it comes to the Olympics. If they want to go there and represent themselves, the Olympics won't take them. They can't go to the UN and say, hey, we're having problems here in the U.S. The United Nations does not recognize them. They are considered a fourth world nation, if you will. Well, that's the way the Kurds are. The Kurds are considered a fourth world nation as well. So that gives you perhaps a little feel, a little appreciation for their background and what goes on with these people called the Kurds, and otherwise known as the Medes in the Bible. There are other examples. Let me give you just a couple of others before I go too far. Other examples of stateless nations in the world as well. The Palestinians over in the Middle East, about 13 million strong, they are a stateless nation. They don't have you hear about Palestine, but Palestine is not a country. They're just Palestinians, they're Arabs. They live in places like Jordan and even Israel and Egypt and you name it. They're Palestinians, but they don't have their own country. The Mayans down in Mexico, the Mayans, the Indians down there, Tibetans, a number of others, and I won't go through all those. But you see, here's the important part about these Kurds and these Medes. The Arabs have always had a hard time knowing exactly what to do with them, the Shia and the Sunni in the Middle East, the Turks especially. And the Turks and they have clashed many times, as they're doing even today, I'm sad to say. But they are descendants, these Kurds are the descendants of the Medes that it talks about in the Bible. Now, if you look at their language today, you will find that they are very similar to another ethnic group called the Persians. The Persians. Persians live down, for the most part, in Iran. Medes live up in this Kurdistan region that I mentioned. The two are very close together. They are non-Arab. They speak the same language. That language is Farsi, F-A-R-S-I, it's called Farsi. So they have many things in common. Well, where does all this take us in terms of the Bible? Well, let me go back to the book of Numbers. In the book of Numbers, there's a fellow by the name of Balaam. Balaam is a prophet. Balaam is not a Hebrew Jewish prophet. He is actually a Mede. He's one of the first Medes that comes along. And Balaam prophesies. And this is something that Balaam says. Listen to this because you'll recognize it. From Numbers 24, it says, I see him. I behold him. He's prophesying about Jesus Christ. Balaam. I behold him. He says, a star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Does it sound familiar now? Doesn't it? It's part of our Christmas, what we do at Christmas. A scepter shall rise out of Israel. One out of Jacob shall rule. That's a very prophetic pronouncement by this fellow Balaam. Balaam has a donkey, if you remember, if you go back in the book of Numbers and read about him. He has a donkey, and Balaam says some wrong things, and then the donkey is going along with Balaam, riding along, and all of a sudden the donkey sees an angel blocking his path, and the donkey rebels, and the donkey starts to talk. Only God can do that. But that's another story. I don't want to get off on Balaam, but I just want to say that Balaam is one of the first Medes that we identify in the Bible. If you go back and research that, you'll find that to be true. Now, here's what happens as time moves along. We know that Israel had a northern state and a southern state. It had 10 tribes up in the north. They were the 10 tribes of Israel. They had 2 tribes down in the south, Dan and Judah. And we know that those northern tribes at a point in time, around 722 before Christ, were taken away. Were taken away and were spirited off. Why? Because they had been rebellious towards God. They had not followed God's edicts and commands and rules. And so the Assyrians, who are the Syrians of today, came into that territory and took these northern tribes away. And they took them up into the land that the Medes occupied, along with other lands. And it tells us that in 2 Kings. 2 Kings says this: the king of Assyria, deported Israel, meaning those 10 northern tribes, to Assyria and settled them in Halah, in Gozan on the Habor River, and in the towns of the Medes. That's where it's significant, the towns of the Medes, in other words, the Kurds. All right, so stick with me on this. They're now settling these tribes of northern Israel. That means the Jews are being settled there in the towns of the Medes. So what do? They intermingle with the Medes. They intermarry with the Medes, okay? So and this is going to be significant a little bit later on. This is where the Medes and the Jews of northern Israel, become one. They coexist, they live together, they marry one another, not exclusively. Sometimes the Medes marry Arabs, other people as well, that's all right. But nonetheless, many of these children that come out of there are Jewish Mede children, if you want to think of it that way, children of the Medes and Jews. That's significant. It will be later on. Now, later, after following that, the major exile of Judah occurs. And we've been studying about on Wednesday nights. We know that King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon comes down and removes the Jews from Judah, the Israelites from Judah. He takes them up into Babylon. We've looked at a wonderful video about Babylon. Babylon is a major power at this time. A king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar is in charge. He's a powerful king. And God designates him to come and take away the Jews from the south, the Israelites from the south, and remove them up into Babylon. Now, Babylon, that happens over the course of 3 different time spans. Starts in 605, and then 597, and 587. 3 major exiles. At the last one, in 587, when they come down, they sack the city of Jerusalem. They burn the city of Jerusalem. They burn it down. Nebuchadnezzar has had his way with the Israelites. He takes them back to Babylon. They are now captive in Babylon, as a number of prophets had predicted they would be. Jeremiah predicted they would be. Isaiah predicted they would be exiled. And they didn't listen, and they didn't believe. And sure enough, God sent Nebuchadnezzar. He appointed Nebuchadnezzar specifically. He says, I want you to go down and bring them back and make them captive in the city of Babylon. That's what happened. And so now, moving along pretty quickly, they are going to be captive in Babylon for at least 70 years. At least 70 years. But then God moves again. You see, God moves in history. God is in charge of things. We don't realize that. We don't think about that. But God has got his people, his Israelites, down here in Babylon. They're captive. They're not happy. And the Babylonians will not let them go. The Babylonians never let any captives go. They're nasty people, believe me. They're a very strong standing army. They've got a major empire, everything about them. So how is God going to deal with that? God appoints another king, a king named Cyrus. And he says, you're going to be my man to free my people, in so many words. He doesn't say it that way, but That's what it boils down to. And he prophesies that through the prophet Isaiah, 150 more years before Cyrus is even on the scene. That's what God does. That's how God operates. He says this in Isaiah 45. He says, I will raise up Cyrus, who nobody knows at this time. They don't even know who Cyrus is. I will raise up Cyrus in my righteousness. I will make all his ways straight. He will rebuild my city, meaning the city of Jerusalem, and set my exiles free. That's amazing. That's one of the most remarkable prophecies of all time. He goes on, he says, I am the Lord, the maker of all things, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd. Cyrus is not a godly man, but God is going to designate him to free his captives from Babylon. He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundations be laid. You see how God is working in history? He's working to restore his people, to bring them back to Jerusalem, to bring them back to Judah. And he's going to do it through this Mede-Persian king, because now the Medes and the Persians have come together. It's called the Medo-Persian Empire. And this Medo-Persian Empire is going to attack Babylon, and they're going to defeat Babylon. And it's amazing how they do it. Stick with me and I'll tell you about that in just a little bit. Let's turn to Ezra chapter 1 and verse 1, something we don't usually get to do, the book of Ezra. But this is, Ezra, of course, is the book where the exiles come back to Judah and Jerusalem. And Ezra writes about that, both Ezra and Nehemiah. And this is what it says. It says, in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, here's that man, Cyrus, this very important man. He appears over 23 times in the scriptures. In the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and to put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, the king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any one of his people among you, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem. And the people of any place where survivors may now be living are to provide him with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with freewill offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem. And you see, here's this man who is not godly, who doesn't know God, Cyrus, and he's designating this is what's going to happen. And then it goes on to say in verse 7 of that same first chapter, it says, King Cyrus brought out the articles belonging to the temple. They had stolen the articles of the temple of God and taken them up to Babylon. And Cyrus returns them, belonging to the temple of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and had placed in the temple of his God in Babylon. Cyrus, the king of Persia, had them brought by Mithridath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And if you read on, it tells you how many gold dishes and silver dishes and gold bowls and silver bowls and all kinds of articles that were taken from the temple. So here's this individual who's Cyrus, designating the fact that these things need to be returned to the temple, and the temple needs to be rebuilt. He's letting the Israelites go, which he does in the year 537 before Christ. Exactly 70 years from the last time of exile that they were brought up there. The Israelites were brought into exile in Babylon. So this is the significance of, of this man, this vessel of God that God has designated. This is the importance of him, very important. A Mede, a Persian, part of the Medo-Persian Empire, the head of the Medo-Persian Empire at this time. There's opposition to rebuilding the temple, and he overcomes that. Cyrus, not one of the Israelites, but Cyrus overcomes that. It's delayed for 18 years for various reasons, because the enemies of Judah, the enemies of the Israelites, are trying to keep them from rebuilding the temple. Now, you know the temple had been built by Solomon originally, so they're rebuilding it now. And then in 516, they finish the temple. The temple is completed and dedicated, rededicated to God. Well, Babylon, you see, had been prophesied by another very famous prophet as well, one that we know, Daniel. Daniel talked a lot about what's going to happen to Babylon, because Babylon, as I say, was so powerful, such a mighty empire. And if you recall the story about the handwriting on the wall, and don't we all? The handwriting on the wall, that's what Daniel says. The king, Belshazzar, now Belshazzar is the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is away at the time. Belshazzar is having a feast. He's having what today we would describe pretty much as an orgy in the palace, in the royal palace in Babylon. And all of a sudden there's this hand that starts writing on the wall. And everybody stops and looks up and says, "What's that? What's going on?" And the hand writes, and it writes 4 different words. And they bring in Daniel, because Daniel can interpret dreams, you know that. Daniel comes in and he says, "Let me tell you what that means, O king. That means you are doomed. That means your kingdom is about to fall. This very night, your life will be required of you," is what he says in so many words. And it is. Belshazzar dies that night. Shortly after, the Medes and the Persians come in force. They take over Babylon. They rule it. King Cyrus is now in charge, and he's the one that's going to issue this edict to release, if you will, to free up the Israelites, to let them go back home. That's why this is so important. That's why the Medes are so important in biblical history. Today, the Jews honor Cyrus. Why? Because he freed them. He freed their ancestors from slavery in Babylon. Now, there's more to the story than this, and there's just a little bit more, but let me share this with you, because this, to me, is one of the most interesting parts of all. Daniel, of course, has been designated by Nebuchadnezzar when he was brought up to Babylon. Daniel was designated as the second in charge of the entire Babylonian empire, an honorable position. Didn't get there overnight. He had to do some things and so forth, but he was eventually designated as that. And you say, well, why would why would this foreign leader designate somebody who was an Israelite, a Jew? Why would he do that? Well, it's very simply this. Nebuchadnezzar realized that an Israelite, a Jew, was no threat to him. Whereas if he had designated somebody within the palace, within his own structure, hierarchical structure, they might want to take over. You know how that works. Coups happen all the time when you've got somebody in power. So Nebuchadnezzar designates Daniel over time to be his second in command. Daniel does that, and does it very effectively, does it very well for Nebuchadnezzar for a number of years, until this incident happens I just described, where Belshazzar, his son, is slain. Nebuchadnezzar is no longer on the scene. All right, the Medes and Persians come in. Daniel retains this position of power and eminence in the kingdom. He's now working for Darius. King Darius, is a Mede, a Kurd. He is in charge. And later on, he will relinquish his throne to Cyrus, okay? We don't need to worry about all that. But nonetheless, Daniel still retains his position as second in command. Daniel is a very godly man. Daniel foresees and prophesies about Jesus Christ. We know that. He talks about the end times. Daniel has some remarkable prophecies about the end times. Daniel is given all kinds of prophecies through God. But one thing that Daniel does consistently, and it tells us this in the scripture, he is in charge of the wise men of that time. The wise men. That's a very significant statement. Let me read it to you. Daniel 2:48, chapter 2, verse 48. It says, "The king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him." Now that's Nebuchadnezzar. He made him ruler over made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Think about that word, wise men. What do we celebrate at Christmas? The wise men, the magi, the visit of the three kings. We're not sure whether they were kings or wise men, are we? Now, how did that come about? This is my belief, interpretation, speculation, whatever you want to call it. Daniel's in charge of the wise men of Nebuchadnezzar's time in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar leaves the scene, Belshazzar is killed, Cyrus comes along, and he's the king. Daniel's still in charge of, quote, the wise men. He is teaching them about God. He's teaching them about Jesus Christ. He's teaching them about what's going to happen, prophecy in the future, things that no man can comprehend, no man or woman can comprehend. And he's teaching them, as I say, about the advent, the coming of Christ. So no doubt in teaching these wise men, he's teaching somebody, we don't know who, either wise men or kings who are going to be eventually the magi that will come and visit, that will come and see the King of Kings, Jesus Christ, in the Advent season when Jesus is born. That's where these kings, you remember they're from the east, and where is Babylon? Up in the east, the northeast, and they're going to come down. It doesn't say northeast in the scriptures, it just says they come from the east. But that fits so well, this story of where the wise men come from. That's why I think that the wise men were Medes or Persians, influenced by the teachings of Daniel in the city of Babylon, later taken over by Cyrus, this great king who released the Israelites. So you see how it all comes together. This man was a vessel of God. God moves in strange ways. We don't understand it. We can't. He moves nations to do his will. He moves people to do his will. And that's what he did with Cyrus, very simply. It's a long story, but it's a very involved story, but it all comes together and makes sense when you put it all together. That's who we serve. That's the God that we serve. If anyone here today wishes to come and give your life, your heart, your soul to Jesus Christ, I would invite you to do that. If you wish to rededicate your life and come and acknowledge him, give a testimony, if you wish to come and have a prayer here at the altar or say something to me or speak with one of the deacons, I would invite you to do that. We're going to stand and sing a hymn of invitation. I would invite you as we stand and sing of this hymn of invitation to come forward, to give your life to Christ. This is the time to do it. Will you stand with me?